Welcome to the podcast, Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path, and I'm your host, Mike Allen. Blind, deaf, and dumb before the age of 2, and yet honored for her writing, her lecturing, and especially her can-do spirit. Helen Keller was one of the most remarkable humans ever to live, and she lived in Easton, Connecticut for 3 decades. Here to tell us about this amazing woman and her years in Connecticut is no stranger to this podcast, Brent Colley, co-historian of the town of Reading. This week's trivia question: in 1939, a ferocious creature terrorized a central Connecticut town. It killed pets and livestock and let out blood-curdling screams at night. What was it? Stick around after the main program for the answer, because then you're going to know the topic for next week's show. Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path is brought to you by our sponsor, Yale New Haven Health. When people need the best quality health care, there's a reason they turn to Yale New Haven Health. In 1826, Yale New Haven Hospital became Connecticut's very first hospital. They were the first hospital in the U.S. to use chemotherapy. Yale New Haven was the first to introduce insulin pumps for diabetic patients, and they introduced the world's first intensive care unit for newborns. For more information about Yale New Haven Health, visit ynhhs.org. That's ynhhs.org. Helen Keller, one of the most gifted and determined human beings of the past few centuries. Helen was just 19 months old when she came down with either meningitis or scarlet fever. Doctors were never certain which it was, but either way, when the fever broke about a week later, it was too late. Her sight and hearing were gone for good. Well, it's hard for people without these disabilities to understand what she and thousands of others like her go through. She was frustrated. Her behavior at age 5, horrible. She'd throw temper tantrums and throw dishes around the dining room, smashing them. She even one day tipped over the crib holding her baby sister. Her parents' friends eventually approached them and suggested institutionalizing young Helen. It was, after all, the 1880s in Alabama, and treatments for such problems were virtually non-existent. But her mother, Kate Keller, felt there had to be a better way, and one day she was reading a book by Charles Dickens. Dickens wrote about a remarkable woman named Laura Bridgman. Now, Laura had been unable to see or hear, but she learned how to communicate through a finger code of some sort. Now, Kate Keller decided it was time to start taking some more proactive steps, so she had Helen seen by an ear, nose, and throat specialist. Well, he couldn't help, but he recommended that they approach Alexander Graham Bell, the inventor of the telephone. It turns out that both Bell's mother and wife were deaf, and Bell had been experimenting with ways to help them. They were able to make contact with Bell, but he said he couldn't help either. He did have, though, an idea. He said, "Go to the Perkins Institute in Boston." It was there that the remarkable Laura Bridgman had learned how to communicate, the same Laura Bridgman written about by Charles Dickens. Well, so 6-year-old Helen Keller would get introduced to 20-year-old Anne Sullivan. Now, Anne Sullivan had just graduated from Perkins, first in her class, in fact. She had been at Perkins because she, too, had had vision challenges in her earlier years. Nevertheless, she could see. So Helen's parents hired Anne Sullivan, brought her back to Alabama, and there Anne observed Helen's outbursts, and she was not very pleased by that, and eventually convinced her parents to let the two of them live separately in a barn behind the house for a few weeks so she could work with Helen one-on-one. Well, there Anne started teaching Helen this finger code system, the same one Laura Bridgman had learned, by pressing her fingers into Helen's palms in a very specific pattern to represent certain words. Now, years later, Helen would write that she was still pretty frustrated because she actually had no concept of the meaning of the word words. She didn't know what they were or how they related to the unseen world around her. One day, Anne was trying to teach Helen this finger code method for mug, the word mug. Well, Helen, still frustrated, got it mixed up. Was it a mug? Did it mean milk? Did it mean drinking? And in her frustration, she threw the mug and broke it. Well, at that point, Anne led Helen outside to the family's water pump. She pumped some water, put Helen's arm under the spout, and let the water pour over her arm, and then spelled out, Water. Now, in Helen's autobiography, which was called The Story of My Life, she said, and I quote, "I stood still, my whole attention fixed upon the motions of her fingers. Somehow the mystery of language was revealed to me. I knew then that Water meant the wonderful, cool something that was flowing over my hand. The living word awakened my soul, gave it light, hope, set it free." Well, by nightfall that very day, she had learned her first 30 words. Helen also learned Braille and how to figure out words by putting her hand on a person's face while they spoke, one finger on the mouth, one on the nose, and one on the larynx or voice box. She also knew who was entering a room by the vibration of their unique footsteps. Eventually, she'd be typing books on a Braille typewriter. And with the assistance of Anne Sullivan, who would be her partner for 50 years, she would travel the world on behalf of the American Foundation for the Blind. She attended Radcliffe, the Harvard for women in those days. She had to take the same entrance exam as other women, the same time limits, and yet she scored higher than most of them. When she graduated, she became the first blind and deaf person to ever earn a college degree. She's also the first woman to receive an honorary doctorate from Harvard. She would meet 13 presidents from Grover Cleveland to Lyndon Baines Johnson, and a movie about her and Anne's life called The Miracle Worker would be made with Patty Duke playing Helen and Anne Bancroft playing Anne. Well, Helen moved to Easton and spent the last 30 years of her life there thanks to a wealthy benefactor also from Easton, Gustav Pfeiffer. And somebody who became a close friend and supporter was Samuel Clemens, better known, of course, as Mark Twain. When she was just 13, long before she would be heading off to Radcliffe, word of Helen's accomplishments was starting to spread, and it was decided to get her an audience with some wealthy New York City benefactors who could support her costly educational needs. And among the people at this meeting were Clemens himself, Lawrence Hutton, who was the guy hosting it at his Manhattan house, Henry Rogers, who was a very wealthy friend of Clemens and, in fact, his own benefactor, and William Dean Howells. He was a magazine editor whose review of Clemens' work decades earlier had catapulted Clemens to stardom. Well, it was at that meeting where Clemens met Helen Keller and had to explain that his name, Mark Twain, was based on the taking of water measurements on steamboats on a river to see how deep the water was so the boat wouldn't bottom out. And here to continue this amazing story is none other than Brent Colley, co-town historian for the town of Reading, who knows the story of Helen Keller well. Brent, when we talk about Helen Keller and all of her many extraordinary and incredible accomplishments, a lot of this started to take off for her in 1895, and she was brought to a home in New York City on 34th Street, Lawrence Hutton's place, for kind of an introduction to some wealthy movers and shakers, just to sort of introduce who this amazing woman was and get her acquainted to some other folks while she was coming to New York City to do her next, stage of studies and whatnot. Tell me what happened at that Lawrence Hutton meeting, and I guess this is where she met Samuel Clemens, Mark Twain.
Yeah, and it almost didn't happen. Eleanor, who was Lawrence Hutton's wife, he was Harper Magazine editor, had been reaching out to Mark Twain earlier that winter to ask him and tell him about this event. They were backing her because they were so impressed with her ability to overcome her situation. And now she could not only read, but she could speak, and she knew multiple languages, and they really wanted to support her in the next step. So they kind of brought in the people higher in that society to meet her and understand how impressive she was. The Friday before the Sunday they meet, Mark Twain is in a bad position personally. He's in deep debt. He has to go later that summer on a world tour to make up and try to pay off that debt. So he's not really himself. And so on Friday, he writes a shorthand note to Hutton, Lawrence, that he's unspeakably sorry, but he can't see this marvelous child. He'll be absent till Monday, but give her my love. And so at some point from Friday to Sunday, his mind is changed. And my best guess is that it's William Dean Howells. I think he probably strong armed him to attend. I think they had a strong enough relationship that if anyone could have made him go, it would have been William Dean Howells. So when he gets there, what he really realizes is that she is aware of her surroundings, which is a surprising thing. They're meeting in the Hutton's library, which is filled with leather-bound books. Her senses or smell, heightened. So she comes in the room with Miss Sullivan, and immediately, without touching anything, obviously not seeing anything, she says, "Oh my gosh, so many books, so many books. How lovely." So that kind of really impresses Twain. And then Howells sits down with her on the couch first. She puts her fingers to his nose, his lips, and his throat, his larynx. That's your voice box. Annie had taught her how to listen to people that way. And I think that's fascinating. She sat there and listened to people. She could hear the vibrations and she could understand. Twain had written that you could see the details of what the story he was telling to her through her reactions and her face. So that was impressive to him, I think, initially. And then he's the next to sit down with her. And so she asks him, probably through Anne Sullivan, to explain the origin of the name Mark Twain. He explains that steamboat pilots, and he thought the name well suited him because he was sometimes light on the surface and sometimes, and she interrupts, deep. So that truly surprises him with her intelligence. And from that point forward, they really become close friends because she enjoys the fact that he treats her like a normal person, and they have funny conversations together from that point forward. And then this meeting would ultimately allow her to go to a school for the blind that works on your speech because of the impressive nature of her time at this little luncheon, if you will. People step up to help her further her education.
Now, this meeting at Hutton's place is in 1895, and there's a great link between this meeting and the meeting when she goes for 3 days to Mark Twain's place in Reading at Stormfield in 1909, when she's then at that point, I guess, about 28 years old. But it all started, the link, because as they were leaving, everybody shakes hands as they're going by, and he doesn't. He pats her on the head. Tell us that story.
So when the meeting or the luncheon begins, Anne Sullivan lets her know who everyone is. She obviously speaks to everyone. And then as they're saying goodbye, they greet her and she says, "Goodbye, so-and-so." And, even more impressive. But for some reason, Twain decides just to walk past her and pat her on the head. And she says, "Goodbye, Mr. Twain." So when she did visit years later in 1909, he did ask her, "How did you know it was me?" And she said, "I could smell you," because, obviously he smoked 20 cigars a day.
Now, let's talk about this 3 day visit because this is fascinating. She shows up with Anne Sullivan, Sullivan's, I guess, recent husband or husband nonetheless, John Macy. They show up at Stormfield for 3 days, and Clemens knows at this point, and one of the things he just cherishes about her is her sense of humor. And so he has a little fun with her when it comes time for a tour of the billiards room. Could you explain that?
As far as the billiards rooms go, this is what she likes best about him, is that he just treats her, like a normal person. So he gives her the tour of the billiards room and he offers to teach her the game. So she takes the bait and innocently replies, "Oh, Mr. Clemens, it takes sight to play billiards." She says, "Not the way my friends play it." The blind couldn't play worse. It just got better as the weekend went on.
Now, there's something else kind of interesting that happened at that meeting that, in the annals of history, goes down as a pretty significant move, actually, was that he gave a gift to Anne Sullivan Macy as she was leaving. to thank her for all she had done on Helen's behalf. It was a postcard. Tell us about that.
Yeah, it's basically where the word worker appears first. In the postcard, it says to Mrs. John Sullivan Macy, with warm regard and with limitless admiration of the wonders she has performed as a miracle worker. And this is something that I found in the archives of the American Foundation for the Blind at that moment in time. This is something that I was able to make a facsimile of, so we have it. What's really odd is it would take 50 years for this term miracle worker to catch on, and how it did was a Broadway show about Annie. So it's a neat tie.
Now, let's talk about some other things that happened during this time. Here Anne Sullivan Macy had taught Helen Keller how to communicate by pushing fingers into her palm to spell words and associate those words with objects that Helen Keller could feel. Then, as life went on and Helen Keller had learned so much from her, Anne Sullivan Macy took a turn for the worse with her own eyesight. Maybe you could explain why this was so significant.
Anne had always suffered from sight problems, and I think that's pretty much what drew her to the relationship. The Perkins School is where she met Laura Bridgman, and Laura Bridgman taught her how to kind of text into the palm. And so that's where she got it. Over the course of her life, she had many surgeries to try to correct her eyesight. I think what people really need to understand is that you're looking at a girl. Her mother died at 8. Her dad left her and her brother. They went into basically the poorhouse up in Tewksbury. Her brother dies, so she has nobody. And finally, a commissioner for the poor comes in, and she tells him straight up, like, I want to go to school. And that's how she got to Perkins. And then from there, she learns, and she actually does so well that she's the school valedictorian. And that's why she gets connected with Helen Keller, because Helen Keller's parents meet with none other than Alexander Graham Bell. He was doing a lot for the blind and the deaf at that moment in time. He says, I can't help her. And obviously no surgeries can either, but you got to get her to Perkins. So that's how she got to Perkins. And that's how she met Annie. So Annie comes in and lives with them, and then they get their relationship. So as time moves forward, Annie falls into a similar situation as Helen, in that her eyesight obviously just ultimately fails. So one of the things that I think was very helpful to Helen and really saved her was Braille. And she knew Braille very well, and she loved Braille. And that's how she wrote her books, with a Braille typewriter. And that's how she knew the world, through reading about it through Braille. So Anne loses her sight, but thankfully she has her hearing. But she is now being taught, starting in roughly 1933, by Helen Keller, how to read Braille, because it was different than when she was teaching it to Helen. And Annie does a nice job of saying that Helen has a lot more patience than she does, because she's really frustrated. And she now understands why Helen was so frustrated when she met her when she was a young child.
Now, when you look at what Helen Keller did, other than just achieve what she did for her own personal self, one of the other just remarkable and extraordinary aspects of her life is how much then she gave back to the handicapped community who did not have sight. How did she get hooked up with the AFB?
She was always involved in helping others. Like right after the World War One, a lot of the soldiers there had become blind. So she helped them to deal with their situation and comfort them. And then she's pretty much raising funds for them, telling people about the foundation and why they should donate money to it. And so ultimately, she becomes their advocate, their ambassador, their champion, because at that moment in time, there weren't that many states in our country that were looking out for people that had these disabilities, whether it was blindness or deafness. So that's how she gets involved. And that eventually turns into how she runs into Gustav Pfeiffer. and that's the man who would bring her to Easton. So he was one of the donors, and he fell in love with her and eventually was able to convince her to come to Easton, Connecticut.
Now, Gus is an interesting character all unto himself. I mean, he put together the company we now today know as Warner Lambert, the drug pharmaceutical company. And so he had a lot of money, and he made Easton his home, and he convinced Helen to come there and actually built her a custom made house that, would help her be able to walk around and navigate through there. And the timing on this is incredible because Anne Sullivan Macy, the one who was helping Helen and then Helen's helping her, she passes away in 1936. And in 1939, she's now able to move into Easton, into this luxurious home in the beautiful section of Easton. And now it's Polly Thompson, who is Helen Keller's secretary, who is more or less left to this role of helping Helen Keller around. And they're traveling, I guess, in Europe in 1946 together, and fire destroys this custom-built home in Easton. What did Gus do?
He rebuilt it the exact same way because she was very familiar with the house, and that obviously is very important for someone that doesn't have sight or hearing. There was no walking sticks, anyone holding her arm. She was self-reliant. She would go outside, check the temperature via a Braille thermometer. What they did to allow her to make it around the outside was they made this beautiful rail of cedar for her. And she would just follow it and enjoy the property and smell all the flowers and herbs along the way and then make her way back to the house.
So over the time that she was in Easton and she was traveling all around the world and helping people raise money for the American Federation for the Blind, and she finally died at home, I think, at almost 88 years of age. What did she leave behind in terms of her legacy?
I look at her home in Easton as a bit of a home base. She was there quite a bit, and a lot of people visited her there at her home because it's obviously easy for her to do so. But the AFB allows her to travel to 39 different countries. So Twain traveled 35, she traveled 39. That's pretty impressive. And she spread the word all across the world. And I love the fact that there's the Helen Keller Middle School to teach the current generations about her and Annie and overcoming things that seem impossible. If you have that drive, that want, you can do it. And I think both of them proved it very well over the course of a lifetime.
Helen Keller's secretary, Polly Thompson, died in 1960. A year later, in 1961, Helen suffered a stroke at her Easton home. And 7 years after that, in 1968, she passed away peacefully in her sleep at her home. In all, Helen Keller wrote 12 books. That wraps up this episode of Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path. I want to add one more quote from Helen Keller to wrap up this episode. It's from her 1957 book, The Open Door. Quote, "Security is mostly a superstition. It does not exist in nature. Life is either a daring adventure or nothing." I want to thank our guest for today's program, Brent Colleague, co-town historian for the town of Reading. The answer to this week's trivia question: in 1939, a ferocious creature terrorized a central Connecticut town, killing pets and livestock and letting out blood-curdling screams at night. What was it? The answer? The Glawacus. That's right, the Glawacus. Next week on Amazing Tales CT, we're going to tell you the fascinating story of this mysterious creature, what we know and what we frankly still don't know, from the undisputed expert on this topic. Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path is a production of True North Associates, LLC. This is Mike Allen. Be safe and stay healthy.